Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this week's seminar in Department of Geography and Environmental Systems. I'm Andy Miller. I'm the coordinator of the department seminar. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce Anisha Jayadevan to introduce our speaker. Before I do, just a couple of things. First of all, we have the opportunity for those who are interested, and some people have already accepted the invitation, to stick around at the end of the seminar for what we're calling a virtual lunch hour, not necessarily an hour. People can stay for as long as they like, but no later than 2 o'clock because Dr. Schwartz has an important meeting at 2 o'clock. And a couple of our graduate students will be meeting with her at 3. But in the meantime, I'm just going to show you what's coming up. So very quickly, here is the schedule for the last month of our seminar series. You see today's topic at the very top there. And then we have Dr. Tiana Bruno next week talking about ecological memory and Black sense of place in the biophysical afterlife of slavery. And then the last 2 seminars this semester are shown below that on the page, and you will get flyers for each of these in turn as they come along. So with that, I am going to go ahead and wait a second, sorry. Where did the participant list go? This always happens. All right, Anisha, go ahead and do the invitation, and because I can't see my participant list anymore.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Naomi Schwartz is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of British Columbia. She completed her PhD in geography at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research focuses on the relationships between climate, disturbance, and vegetation, and how they are influenced by human activities in tropical biomes. She is interested in how we can use remote sensing and other geospatial approaches to better understand ecosystems at landscape to regional scales. Specifically, she's interested in tropical second growth forests and the ecological and social factors that will influence how much they will help us with climate change mitigation. Welcome, Dr. Schwartz, and over to you.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Anisha. Let me just share my screen with you all. Let me know if you cannot see that or if anything is amiss with the screen sharing. Let's see. Can I ask, does anyone know how to keep your video in the front on the WebEx? I'd like to keep it in front of my presentation.
When you say, you mean to keep the view of the people in the room?
Mm-hmm. Or just, yeah, so I can still see I mean, no big deal if not.
If you go to the layout screen, the layout symbol on the upper right,
yeah,
it allows you to have things side by side or stacked. You can have full screen view or not.
Okay.
Can you see that menu?
Yeah, I think you're just going to be hidden behind my PowerPoint slide for me, but that's all right. So thank you so much for that introduction, Anisha. I'm really excited to be here. I've heard really wonderful things about your department from Matt, who's been my colleague for quite a few years. We did our PhD together at Colombia, not at University of North Carolina. And yeah, he's told me wonderful things about your department, and I've received such a warm welcome already. And yes, I'm really thrilled to get the chance to tell you all a bit about my work. Today, I'm going to focus on some work I've done understanding impacts of land use change and climate extremes in tropical second growth forests. So this is a geography department. We've all probably quite familiar with the reality of climate change, and many of you are probably also familiar with this concept of natural climate solutions. The recent IPCC report that came out just a few weeks ago found that natural climate solutions are among the most effective strategies for mitigating climate emissions. So in particular, reforestation, avoided forest conversion, natural forest management, other natural climate solutions associated with forests are really essential to for keeping us to 1.5 degrees warming and getting us to net zero emissions by 2050. These are absolutely they're essential for getting to net zero by 2050. They're not substitutes for reducing or eliminating fossil fuel use, but they're an important part of the picture. And as you can see in this fun infographic, the largest natural climate solution, the largest contribution is through reforestation, which this paper from the Nature Conservancy estimated would be the equivalent of taking about 650 million cars off of the road. So that's a pretty big contribution. And specifically, tropical reforestation could have the largest climate impacts. So this is from, let's see. Oh, did I just put this on this? You can probably now see yourselves. Just messing around here with this. Okay, so this.
We can still see your slide.
Oh, you can. Oh, okay, yes. Great. All right. So this figure is from a paper from that came out in 2020 that estimated above ground carbon sequestration rates in potential forest restoration areas worldwide. And what I want you to notice is that the darkest shades of green are present in the tropics. So that means that tropical forests have the fastest rates of above ground carbon accumulation of all forests. So reforestation in the tropics and tropical second growth forests could be a really essential natural climate solution. So where do these estimates of above ground carbon sequestration rates come from? So they typically come from chronosequence plots. Which is a technique used in a lot of ecological research that uses space for time substitution to understand long-term trajectories of ecological change. So it's unfeasible, as much as I'd love to, go back in time 50 years ago and establish a bunch of forest plots and track forest succession over 50 years. It's unfeasible to do this, and especially at the time scales of most ecological studies. And so in order to understand successional change in forests, we identify forests that span a range of ages. So for example, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, like in these photos. And we we compare forests across this range of ages. We compare forest plots across space and then attempt to infer changes that would happen over time by comparing forest characteristics across plots of different ages. So for example, this is a study that synthesized chronosequences across the American tropics to look at variation in the rate of above ground carbon accumulation. And each line represents one chronosequence study. And this has been really useful to demonstrate the rapid rate of recovery of above ground biomass relative to old growth. So each of these lines is one set of plots. And these are the changes that you see across space, across plots of different forest ages. But I like to think of these estimates of carbon uptake as kind of aspirational. So these plot-based studies are biased. Forest chronosequences are typically established in surviving, relatively undisturbed forests. And this bias means that we could be overlooking and underestimating the impacts of disturbance and reclearing on rates of change in second growth forests. And factors such as disturbance and reclearing might be especially important in second growth forests because they're located in, they're sort of non-randomly distributed across landscapes and located in unique landscape positions that could alter exposure to disturbance or reclearing. So for example, second growth forests, reforestation often tends to happen at high elevations and on steep slopes, and in small fragments and close to forest edges. So on the left is a study identifying regions that underwent reforestation in all of Latin America and the Caribbean. And you can see that those locations were at higher elevations. And then these are some results from a study that I conducted in the Peruvian Amazon. And you can see that regrowth forests are in smaller patches and are closer to forest edges. So they're highly fragmented. And so for better and more realistic estimates of what second growth forests can contribute to climate change mitigation, we need to start better incorporating landscape context and disturbance into our understanding of successional trajectories. So in my talk today, I'm going to present results from several studies that aim to incorporate landscape context and bridge plot level research with landscape and global scale research into our understanding of the contribution of second growth forests to climate change mitigation. And so I use plot and remote sensing data to ask, how does landscape context mediate impacts of climate extremes and land use change in tropical second growth forests? And so I've broken this talk up into two parts. So in the first part, I'll talk about how landscape context influences drought response in second growth forests in Puerto Rico. So focusing on exposure to climate extremes in second growth forests. And then in the second part, I'll talk about exposure of second growth forests to anthropogenic disturbance, and specifically focused on understanding permanence of second growth forests, or how likely they are to avoid being re-cleared after establishing, and for how long, and what are the implications of permanence or lack thereof for carbon dynamics. So yeah, I'll talk first about this work on drought. So many of you are you're probably aware that I lost this again. So you're probably aware that climate models predict changes in mean annual rainfall throughout most of the tropics by 2100. So some parts of the tropics will get wetter. Much of the tropical Americas will get drier, with decreases in mean annual rainfall expected of, on the order of magnitude of 15 to 25% in some regions. And so second growth forests will be regenerating over the next decades in a different climate than they've established up to this point. And they'll be exposed to more frequent, possibly more frequent and possibly more severe droughts. And so understanding how second growth forests respond to drought is really important for predicting their contribution to climate change mitigation. So what predicts vulnerability to drought in second growth forests? So first, stature is really important, not just in second growth forests, but in forests in general. So many studies have found that tall trees are more vulnerable to drought. So second growth forests tend to be somewhat shorter than old growth. So we might expect that second growth forests might be somewhat more resilient to drought. Then there's also differences in species composition across second growth and old growth forests. So lots of studies have demonstrated that species with traits that represent fast or acquisitive life history strategies, so fast-growing pioneer species, which are more abundant early in succession, might be more vulnerable to drought. And early successional forests often have a higher abundance of these acquisitive species, and so they might be more vulnerable to drought. When we consider stature, maybe less vulnerable. When we consider species composition, maybe more vulnerable. What about landscape context? So as I showed you earlier, second growth forests tend to be in smaller patches or closer to forest edges. And it's possible that this means that second growth forests might be more vulnerable to drought. Edges tend to have a higher proportion of pioneer species than interior forests, so edge forests might be more vulnerable to drought, and edges also tend to have drier microclimates than interior forests. So this might mean, on the one hand, that drought is more severe in second growth forests, but on the other hand, it might also mean that trees at forest edges are more acclimated to dry conditions and so may suffer less severe drought effects. And empirical studies on this phenomenon have been limited, and the results have been quite mixed, one way or the other. So it's not clear whether small patches or pixels closer to forest edges will suffer more severe drought effects, but that's sort of my working hypothesis. And then finally, landscape position could be important. So drier topographic positions, steeper slopes, southwest-facing aspects, ridge tops might be more vulnerable to drought, and lots of studies, particularly in temperate forests, have shown this. And like I mentioned earlier, second growth forests often established in these drier topographic positions. These are steeper sites that are more marginal for agriculture, so might be removed from cultivation or abandoned preferentially. We might also find that there are sort of these multi-scalar impacts of topography. So micro-topographic variation on the scale of individual trees could influence the exposure to drought on the scale of individuals, in addition to topographic variation along sort of the hill slope scale. And so how these factors interact to shape landscape scale patterns of drought in tropical forests landscapes is not well understood. And so I'm going to present results now from two different studies that together address the question of how these individual and species level differences interact with landscape factors to generate variation in drought response across heterogeneous tropical landscapes. And in these studies, I use complementary plot and remote sensing based approaches. So forest plots provide essential information on forest responses to drought. For example, helping us understand differences in drought response across species. But scaling these approaches up to understand the influence of landscape factors is really challenging because of the logistics that would be associated with collecting sufficient field data across patchy and heterogeneous landscapes. And so remote sensing, which I'm in a geography department, so many of you probably use a lot of remote sensing in your work. And so you're well aware that it's got very broad spatial coverage, high temporal resolution, and we can use it to detect ecological patterns that might be unfeasible or impossible to detect in field studies. Right, and so there we go, there's my mouse. So I'm going to share some results from two studies, one focused on understanding, on plot data and focused on understanding individual drought response across individual trees in relation to size, traits, and topographic position. And then the second is a remote sensing study where I explore how forest age, fragmentation, and topography influence landscape variability and drought effects. And so as a case study, I'm considering a drought that happened in 2015 in Puerto Rico. Rainfall was less than 2/3 normal, so it was reduced by about 35%. This study was conducted in forests in and around the El Yunque National Forest. So El Yunque is a volcano that is covered with old growth forest at the tops of the mountain. And it's within a national forest, which is delineated by this boundary here. And a lot of the interior forest is old growth and was never cleared, but at the lower elevations, around both inside and outside the national forest, there was previously extensive land use, farming, logging, charcoal production. Those forests were almost completely cleared. As you can see, there's almost no old growth forest left except for in this core interior. And many of these areas have since regenerated and now represent a mosaic of forest fragments that range in age from 20 to 60 years that are interspersed with some pasture and other cultivated lands. So this is a picture of what this region looks like, although you can't see the tip top of El Yunque. But given this variation in fragment size, in forest age, and in topography, this is sort of the perfect natural laboratory to ask these questions about interactions between forest age, topography, and fragmentation and drought response. And then, you know, this 2015 drought provided a really great opportunity to explore this. So like I said, I'm presenting results from two separate studies. So the first was a plot-based analysis, so an analysis of forest census data. So we used tree census data from 4 forest plots in second growth forest around El Yunque National Forest. These plots have been censused annually since 2013. Within these plots, we've mapped every individual stem, and because we've done that, we can then extract microtopography data, so data on the fine scale topographic conditions for each individual stem that was derived from a 1 meter digital elevation LiDAR derived digital elevation model. So we've got slope and curvature, which is a measure of the concavity or convexity of the surface. So we've got this fine scale data on microtopography of individual trees. And then we also had some data on functional traits. So we considered 2 functional traits, specific leaf area and wood-specific gravity or wood density. These traits in lots of other studies have been demonstrated to be broadly relevant to resource acquisition, demographic rates, and stress responses. And so we fit hierarchical Bayesian models predicting growth and survival as a function of drought and microtopography, with species-specific parameters as a function of these functional traits. And I won't go into any of the gory details on the model, but if you're interested in the statistics or in hierarchical Bayesian modeling, I'd be glad to chat about that afterwards. So that's the plot-based analysis. And so when I talk about results from this study, you'll see this little symbol to show you that it's the data from the forest plots. And I'll contrast those results with results from the satellite data analysis. So this study used Landsat 7 and 8 imagery. We used the entire Landsat record for Puerto Rico to derive 2 vegetation indices. So the Enhanced Vegetation Index, which is a measure of vegetation greenness. It's a pretty good proxy for productivity or vegetation health. And then NDWI, which is a Normalized Difference Water Index, which is a proxy for vegetation water content. We use these long records of these vegetation indices to derive vegetation index anomalies for the drought period and also for the year after the drought to assess the rate of recovery from the drought. And then from this time a 30-meter digital elevation model, that the SRTM data, we were able to derive slope and aspect. So again, these are 2 measures of topography that have been shown to be important for understanding drought response in temperate regions in particular. And then incorporated data on forest age and fragmentation from a land cover data set and LiDAR-derived metrics of canopy height. And so we put all of these data sets into random forest regression models to predict the vegetation index anomalies. So for both vegetation indices for the year during and after the drought from these other predictor variables. And when I talk about the results from this study, you'll see this little satellite to remind you that in this case, the unit of analysis isn't an individual tree, but rather it's a pixel, which is representing an entire, about a 30 by 30 meter forest stand. And I just briefly want to note that these are different studies with different methods for analysis. They were published separately. They are not necessarily directly or quantitatively comparable, but by synthesizing their results, I think we can gain some qualitative insights into drought response at individual landscape scales and note the similarities and then the places where we see different results across these scales. So what did we find? So from the forest plot data, we found that drought affected individual tree growth, but not survival. So on the left, you can see average growth for from the first census interval, 2013 to 2014, 2015, 2016. Growth was less than half of the previous year during the drought year, but survival was no different and growth rebounded quite quickly in 2016. So there seems to be a visible drought effect, but then very fast recovery. When we look at the satellite data, we see something similar, where we see that the vegetation indices, both EVI and NDWI, were lower during the drought year on average, but that they've quickly rebounded to be equal or almost equal to the pre-drought period. So they did recover quickly. So this suggests that at least to this particular short-term drought, these forests are actually quite resilient. So I get to give you a little bit of good news about tropical forests, which is nice. When we looked at the role of stature, we saw some interesting differences between the plot data and the satellite data. So these are the parameters from this model, and I'll just ask you if you'll focus on what's in the red box here. So The effect of drought on growth was negative, and there was a negative interaction with drought and diameter such that bigger trees were more negatively affected during drought. But when we look at the results from the remote sensing data, we see the opposite. So here is a partial dependence plot from these random forest regression models. I'll show you a few of these plots, but the way to interpret these is that on the y-axis is the predicted values for the two different vegetation index anomalies. So more negative value indicates more negative drought response or a more severe drought response. And then the points are and the lines are the predicted values from the random forest regression model as a function of the variable on the x-axis. And so what you can see is that taller canopies actually experienced less negative anomalies of these vegetation indices during drought. So this is pretty surprising, and I think I don't have a particularly great explanation for this phenomenon. I think it might be due to differences in environmental conditions or species composition across the landscape that are associated for forest height that aren't accounted for in our model. I also wonder if we might start to see an effect with a longer or more severe drought, so on the vegetation indices. So some studies have found that taller trees don't experience a more severe growth response, although we did see that, but they do experience a more severe effective mortality, and so that could explain part of why we see this result. So considering the effects of topography, so here I'm just showing the x-axis is slope. It's a unitless measure of slope. And on the y-axis is the predicted probability of growth on the top and survival on the bottom. And you can see that there is a significant effect of slope. And again, this is the microtopography. So this slope calculated from a very fine scale, DEM. There's an effective microtopography on survival, but not on growth. And this effect doesn't differ across drought years. So there is some effective microtopography, but it doesn't appear to be particularly important, especially during the drought year. But on the other hand, when we consider the effects of coarse scale topography, this does conform with our expectations. So we do see that, so this is a transformed measure of aspect where one is more southwest facing, so drier topographic position. And we see that more southwest aspects and steeper slopes had more negative drought anomalies as predicted. But I would also note that when we compared the variable importance from these models, topography was the least important variable. So the effects are in the direction we predicted, but they're quite weak. So what was important? Well, it turns out fragmentation was the most important predictor of remotely sensed drought response. Area, this is patch size, right? So smaller patches had more negative anomalies for these vegetation indices, and forests closer to edges also had more negative anomalies. And so this was sort of surprising, especially given that there's been weak or little evidence that fragmentation does affect drought response. Once we had controlled for the effect of fragmentation, the effect of second growth forests on drought response was relatively weak. So what this figure is showing is vegetation index anomalies during drought and the year after the drought for old growth forests in green and second growth forests in brown. And you can see that the anomalies are a little bit lower for second growth forests during the drought. But that they actually recover even more strongly than old growth forests. So, and this effect, this was again one of the weaker effects when we looked at the variable importance. So it was as weak or weaker than the effect of topography. So I think that this is actually a fairly good news story. So the plot and remote sensing data both suggest that these forests are resilient at least to a short-term drought. And this is consistent with some other studies that have found that, including some experimental studies that have found that tropical forests respond to drought only after multiple years of drought. Some studies experience more immediate and more lasting effects. And so I think understanding the differences across tropical forests in their resilience to short-term versus long-term drought is important for future research. Fragmentation was a really strong predictor of drought response. So that's worrisome because second growth forests and old growth forests are becoming increasingly fragmented. But to put a little bit more of a positive spin on it, fragmentation can be managed, right? We can do forest restoration in strategic ways that reduce fragmentation, et cetera. And so I think that that's not necessarily all bad news. And then I guess I want to mention that the inconsistencies between the plot and the remote sensing data that we find here highlight the need for further work that incorporates the landscape context into understanding forest responses to climate extremes, because it's not so simple to sort of, especially when we think about the effects of both topography and forest height, it's not so simple to sort of observe the effects within a plot and then extrapolate to a landscape. I think that that a sort of multifaceted, multi-scalar approach like that, like the one I demonstrate here, is really important. So that's the first part of my talk. So I'm going to move on to talking a bit more about anthropogenic disturbance in tropical in second growth forests. So this is probably fairly obvious, and I mentioned it earlier, but permanence of second growth forests is a requirement for carbon sequestration, right? Re-clearing second growth forest undoes any carbon sequestration, any previous carbon gains in those forests. And so I'm going to talk about some work that I led to identify where forest permanence occurs and what the implications of permanence or lack thereof are for carbon sequestration in second growth forest. So lots of studies, I've shown a few examples already, and this is another example of a study that shows the potential carbon accumulation in existing tropical second growth forests. So this is, I call this a snapshot study. So it took a map of second growth forest in 2008, so a snapshot of what of the distribution of second growth forest. And it estimated that if these forests were all allowed to continue to regenerate, these forests would accumulate a total above ground carbon stock of 30 petagrams of CO2, which is equivalent, it's a lot of carbon. It's equivalent to carbon emissions from fossil fuel use and industrial processes for all of Latin America and the Caribbean from 1993 to 2014. So that's a lot of carbon. But like I said, this study is a snapshot. It looks at one point in time and asks how much carbon there would be if all of the second growth forests persisted. So like these chronosequence studies, I think of this as an aspirational study. This is an absolute best case scenario. So what I wanted to do with this work is to add a little bit of realism to the snapshot approach. It's unlikely that all of the second growth forest will persist. So to what extent is lack of permanence problematic, and how can we predict permanence? And so I'm going to take you to this area in the Peruvian Amazon to sort of add that dose of realism. So this is the region where I did my dissertation research. It's near the city of Pucallpa, which is the only Amazonian city in Peru that's connected to Lima by road. When I started working there in I first went there in 2013, the population was a little over 100,000, and I looked in preparation for this talk, and in the last decade, it's grown to over 300,000 people now. So it's been growing really fast. So as you might expect, this has made this region a hotspot for land conversion and logging, as well as oil palm, cacao, and other commodity crop production. And there's also been a lot of rural to urban migration, which has led to an increase in second growth forest cover. And so if you went there in 2013, the first time that I went there, things looked really promising for second growth forest. So this is, again, a snapshot of what the landscape looked like in 2013. And you can see there's lots of purple, a lot of second growth forest. So this might look like good news for carbon sequestration in second growth forest. And I went there knowing that there was lots of second growth forest. I was planning to study the influence of fire on successional trajectories, but I noticed while working there that a lot of second growth forest was really young. So what I want you to do is choose a purple patch, choose a purple pixel and focus on it throughout this animation, which is showing annual land cover from 1985 to 2013. And odds are the purple patch that you're looking at will blink in and out of existence once or twice during this time period. This is because second growth forest is often cyclically re-cleared and regenerated. So we have seen this big increase in second growth forest in the study area during the last 30 years. And these are just the data from that land cover data set that I showed you, just aggregated into a figure. Almost half of the study area, or almost half of the forest in the study area was second growth by 2013. So there's been this big increase, but how much will it contribute to climate change mitigation given the dynamics of re-clearing and permanence? And so here I asked, can we predict regrowth and permanence of second growth forest? Where does forest regrow and where does it persist? And what are the implications of these land use dynamics for carbon accumulation at the landscape scale? And I'll just note that a lot of restoration is planned as part of, I mentioned this earlier, but as part of many different, the COP pledges, the different climate accord pledges. And an unresolved question in these restoration commitments is how to promote permanence. And so part of the goal here is to understand where forest is permanent in order to be able to better enhance the permanence of future forest restoration and natural regeneration. So to do this, I use this data set. This built off of work that my colleague Victor Gutierrez Velez began in the region, mapping land cover, and I expanded that land cover time series further back in time. And having this time series of land cover data gives us a snapshot of that landscape every year. So we have a picture of the landscape every year for 28 years, and we can ask for pixels that or locations that aren't forest in a given year, we can say, did forest regrow here? So where does second growth forest establish? And for second growth forest that's already present, did the forest persist or was it cleared? We can also then calculate for every location on the landscape spatial variables such as distance to roads, distance to rivers, distance to villages, and characteristics of forest patches such as patch size and forest age, the history of the pixel, had it been re-cleared in the past, for how long was it re-cleared, etc. And then we can use all of these data to model transition probabilities for any location on the landscape. And so to do this, we put all of these variables and some other ones into generalized linear mixed models to predict regrowth and clearing of second growth forest. And I'm not going to discuss the detailed results of this model, but I'll just point out what I think is a fairly interesting result, which is the response of the probability of re-clearing with forest age. So this was sort of what we expected. We thought that the probability of clearing of second growth forest would increase with forest age and then decline. Older forests tend to be sort of nicer. When I did field work in the region, landowners would talk to me about their nicer forests. They were kind of more proud of it, did more work to maintain it. And so this was supported in our findings, but we also interestingly saw that the peak probability of clearing was at about 4 to 5 years of age, which corresponds really well with the typical fallow cycle and also the minimum harvest age for Bolina, which is a cheap timber species common in young second growth forests, and it's often planted as an enrichment planting in fallows. And I think this is really neat because it shows how the remote sensing approach can capture the emergent effects of human activities that we know are important for driving dynamics in this region. So now we can ask, how will this landscape change in the future? And how much more carbon can we expect the forest in this landscape to store in the future? And so we can use the findings from the models that we fit to project future trajectories of regrowth forest regrowth and forest reclearing, and to then compare those modeled future trajectories to a snapshot scenario where we assume that all forest is permanent, all second growth forest is permanent and continues to grow and sequester carbon, which is the scenario in that continental scale paper that I showed you at the beginning of this section. So we simulated future trajectories of land use change. And so there are two scenarios. So there's the snapshot scenario or the static land use scenario where all the second growth forest that's present in 2013 continues to be forest, keeps aging and accumulating carbon. So you can see that after 2013, the area of second growth forest doesn't increase, but the second growth forest that's there all ages into this older age class. And then we've got the dynamic scenario on the right, where we use the parameters of the model to simulate future trajectories. So the area in second growth forest increases, but the relative proportions of different age classes don't change much. And so we use the relationship between forest age and carbon that we derived from a set of chronosequence plots in the study area to calculate total carbon stored in second growth forest under these two scenarios. And we find a discrepancy of almost 1 million tons of carbon between these two scenarios. And so this discrepancy was equal to about 1% of all of the emissions cuts that Peru planned through their intended contribution to the Paris Climate Accord. So this is a really large discrepancy. This is a fairly small area and a large amount of carbon discrepancy that you see between these two different scenarios. So this finding led us to wonder whether this phenomenon was the exception or the norm in second growth forests across Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is a study that considered reforestation in Latin America and the Caribbean from 2001 to 2010. That was led by Mitch Aid, who's a collaborator on this next project. And it shows locations of reforestation in blue in a lot of Latin America and the Caribbean, especially Colombia, parts of Brazil, Mexico. We wanted to know whether this persisted. So does this picture change when we consider a longer time scale and also more possible trajectories of forest change beyond deforestation and reforestation? So we used data from a time series of land cover from 2000 to 2014 based on a random forest classification of MODIS data into several different categories. This land cover product did exclude forest plantations, but there is some classification error. And we aggregated the land cover data to approximately 1,200 square kilometer hexagon grid cells to minimize the influence of per pixel noise. And this unit of analysis roughly corresponds with the average municipality size in Latin America. So instead of analyzing individual pixels now, we're considering time series of land cover in these aggregated grid cells. So for each grid cell, we have a 14-year time series of land cover. So some example time series are pictured here. So on the x-axis you have year, and on the y-axis is the proportion of forest cover. And so in other studies that look at deforestation and reforestation, they sort of consider these three possible trajectories where forest cover is flat, there's no change, or there's a decline in forest cover, or forest cover increases. Our innovation in this study was to consider a broader variety of possible trajectories that forest cover could take. So we used this shape select package, which is a non-parametric method to choose the best fit from several candidate shapes to identify the best fit shape from these 5 possible trajectories. So we incorporated reforestation reversals and deforestation reversals. We also used a bootstrapping procedure to reduce the influence of noise. And so you'll see that some trajectories are classified as low confidence. These were noisy trajectories where we couldn't really say with strong confidence whether it belonged to any particular group. So what did we find? Well, we find that reforestation reversals greatly outnumber reforestation. So you see a lot more yellow than you do pink. So about 60% of the hexagon grid cells experienced no change in forest cover, and deforestation still accounted for about 20% of the hexagons. But importantly, we found that the reversals of reforestation, so again, this yellow, was about 10 times as common as the sustained increases in forest cover. reforestation reversals occurred in about 11% of the grid cells. Most reforestation reversal cells still had a net increase in forest cover over the study period. And so this highlights how, had we looked at just 2 points in time, we would have missed these more detailed long-term trajectories, and we might not have seen the recent reversal and the fact that in the shorter term, there's been a decline in forest cover. And so to me, this highlights the importance of looking at a more detailed time series, not just 2 points in time. We compared across countries, and I won't go into too much detail on these findings, but these differences across countries does suggest that there's an important, a strong importance of local social, economic, and policy context. We found really high rates of reforestation reversals in Venezuela and Colombia, which we hypothesize is due to political and economic shifts in these countries. So in Colombia, the peace accord increased safety and accessibility of a lot of places where reforestation had happened during conflict. And this is consistent with other recent findings showing that deforestation in protected areas has increased in the post-conflict period in Colombia. And in the case of Venezuela, we hypothesize that economic crisis and food shortages may have led to deforestation on recently reforested land. So finally, we wanted to know how much carbon sequestration potential is missed due to reforestation reversals. And so we did some back of the envelope calculations to compare the amount of carbon that would have accumulated if no reforestation reversals occurred to that which actually occurred. So this is just an example trajectory. So the black line shows the actual trajectory of forest cover in the region, and then the green line, which we call the carbon sequestration potential, is an estimate of how much biomass would have been accumulated if forest cover was sustained at that maximum level right there and didn't decline subsequently. And then the orange line shows the estimated carbon uptake given the actual trajectory of forest cover, and assuming also that the youngest forests were cleared first. So this is a very conservative estimate. And the difference between the observed and the potential is what we're calling the lost carbon potential due to reforestation reversal. So what did we find? Well, we found that these reversals of reforestation have really large impacts on climate sequestration. So this map, apologies if it's a bit hard to see, but it shows the potential carbon sequestration. So again, how much carbon would have been stored had there been no reforestation reversals. And across the region, we found that in 2001 to 2014, we estimate that there would have been approximately 0.6 petagrams of carbon sequestered in these new forests. But with clearing, about a quarter of that was sequestered. And this is a gap of about 76% between the potential and observed reforestation. So this gap is revealed by thinking beyond this loss-gain dichotomy and considering how forest cover gain can take a wider variety of possible shapes and incorporating land use dynamics into our estimates of carbon sequestration in second growth forests. To me, this illustrates that the drivers of regrowth and forest transitions themselves can be impermanent. So regrowth, natural regeneration and spontaneous regrowth occurs when social or economic drivers and conditions are favorable to regrowth and second growth forests. So things like rural to urban migration, agricultural intensification, etc., can lead to abandonment of agricultural lands and vegetation regrowth, but these drivers can themselves be impermanent. So I think if we've learned anything from the upheaval of the last few years, social and economic change can happen really quickly, and that this can have really big impacts on land cover dynamics and on carbon storage in second growth forests. And second growth forests lack protection in many places. So if in most countries, there are no laws that protect second growth forests from deforestation. And so if we're relying on these economic and social factors that produced forest transitions and led to increases in woody vegetation cover, if we're relying on those things to sort of remain constant to maintain second growth forest cover, it's quite problematic. So just to wrap up, some key takeaways from the whole talk. So I hope I demonstrated to you that the contribution of second growth forests as a natural climate solution is limited by exposure to disturbance and clearing, and that we really need landscape studies to reveal this. So the landscape studies that I presented here reveal some of the limitations of plot-based approaches for predicting second growth forest dynamics. I also want to say that we need landscape scale studies. I also want to make a pitch for place-based landscape scale studies. So I think we're really in this era of big data and data syntheses, and there are still lots of people doing field research and then lots of people doing global analyses, but I think that landscape studies, that place-based landscape studies still have a lot of important insight to give us in terms of second growth forest dynamics, exposure to disturbance, future trajectories of land cover change and what that means for climate change. And I also, a huge oversight here, didn't really mention biodiversity conservation at all in this talk. I really focused on carbon, but there's also a lot of potential for second growth forests to contribute to biodiversity conservation. And so all of these factors need to be considered when understanding the multiple benefits of second growth forests. I'd also mention that I demonstrate how we can use landscape studies to understand the spatial and historic factors that influence exposure to disturbance, regrowth, and permanence. And understanding these factors can help us target management and policy to permanent. So fragmentation increases exposure to disturbance, but like I mentioned in the first part of the talk, that's something that that we can actually do something about. We can reduce fragmentation by strategic land management and forest restoration. And then the last point I want to make is that it's really important that we manage our expectations for the contribution of forest restoration and natural regeneration to climate change mitigation. I think that people are really desperate for a good news climate story. And we also, tropical second growth forests are really appealing because it's a relatively inexpensive solution, it's relatively fast. And so there's a lot of hope and optimism being placed on second growth forests. And I think that it's really important, I say keep our eyes on the prize, that we keep our eyes on the prize and aren't distracted from the importance of other climate solutions, such as reducing or eliminating fossil fuel use, et cetera, by these stories about tropical second growth forests and what they can do for us. Because I think that a lot of these need to come with a bigger grain of salt. So that's just my little 2 cents to end the talk with. So at this point, I'll wrap up. I'll thank all of my collaborators on these projects. So quite a few people who helped collect the data, who helped develop the questions, analyses, et cetera, contributed to the papers, and thank my funding sources. And my contact info is up there, as well as my website. So if you don't have time to meet me today, although I'm looking forward to meeting many of you, please do reach out. I'm also on Twitter. Yeah, so thanks again for listening. And I think we've probably got a little bit of time for some questions. So looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you, Naomi. That was really fascinating. I think that what we're going to do, since we've sort of arranged we're going to kind of do this virtual lunch hour, is we will keep the recording going for as long as there are questions that are directly pertinent to the seminar, even though a number of people do have to leave at 1 o'clock. And then we'll turn off the recording when we're just chatting. So I would invite people to please post questions in the chat. We'll ask you to unmute and ask your question in the order posted. So I don't see any yet. So while I'm waiting for the first question to show up in the chat, I'm going to ask one. There was the curve that you showed with the reversal in the period, in the latter period, looked like it took a sharp turn. Yeah, if we can look at that, there you are. So that takes a sharp turn around 2009, 2010. Before that, it's on a sharp upward trajectory. I'm looking at the bottom, dot dash curve. What happens there?
You know, I pulled out this one trajectory because it was probably the best illustration of the technique that I used for the calculation, for calculating the observed versus potential. And this was a few years ago, and I don't actually remember where exactly that was from. So I don't know, I can't speculate as to like this particular curve because I don't remember where it was from, but I can talk more generally about what are some of the factors that might influence these kind of abrupt changes in forest dynamics. One thing that we see in some places is that there's a natural disturbance, for example, a drought year where there's a lot of fire or potentially a hurricane or something like that. And so that kind of initiates this cycle of forest clearing. So there's a lot of degradation, loss of forest cover that happens from this disturbance. And sometimes natural disturbance will do some of the hard work of forest clearing. And then people will come in and say, oh, well, this is already burned. This forest has lost some of its quality. It's degraded. So we're going to sort of follow through with the clearing. And so I think in a region where you see that sort of abrupt decline, that could be part of what's going on. There are also sometimes policy changes that can lead to these sorts of changes, and sometimes also like trends in agricultural practices. So if all of a sudden, like you saw this in the region in Peru where I worked, there was a lot of re-clearing of second growth forests that happened in the early 2000s as oil palm got really popular, oil palm cultivation. So as that trend sort of caught on, it was something that people could do with that second growth forest land. And so you would see a trend like that with oil palm. So does that answer your questions? I can't tell you.
I think so. I mean, clearly it's multiple causes and they're going to differ from one place to another.
Yeah.
Matt, do you have time to ask your question before you have to leave, or do you want somebody else to ask it for you? Matt Baker has a question posted.
Thanks for a great talk. That was really interesting. And I have lots of questions, but I have to go. So I'm going to ask one and then maybe catch up later. In the field studies and the chronosequences you showed, first of all, I really love the idea of combining field studies with remote studies, and also the advocacy you shared at the end for landscape level understanding and the context of what you see in any given pixel. So, but given that, I'm wondering, there in those field studies and the chronosequences, there was, a conventional increase for younger forests and then plateauing, but there were really different magnitudes across the range of studies that you showed in that figure. And I wonder if you've gone back to the location of those places with your remote sense data and tried to understand how they behave through the time series that you're looking at. The reason I'm thinking about that is one of our colleagues, Earl Ellis, has sort of looked at that kind of context for field-based studies as a way of understanding globalization. And I think that that's a really interesting idea, and you have that potential here. So I'm wondering if you have any insight from that study from 2016.
Yeah, that's a great question and a great idea. So I have personally not done that with this data set, but this is this comes from a massive collaboration. So one of those lines corresponds to the chronosequence plots that I established in Peru, but this comes from a massive collaboration all over the tropical Americas. And there's been a lot of efforts to try to understand these differences. So like within this paper that this figure is from, one of the things that they look at is, for example, climate, so rainfall and how that predicts the rate. So there's some attempt to put it in the climatic context and also in the soil context. So to understand the degree to which differences in soils predict the differences in rates across plots. And I think that there is a paper in the works that is incorporating fragmentation to better predict or to see if fragmentation helps better predict the rates of carbon sequestration. across these plots as well. I would also imagine that disturbance history and exposure to or lack thereof disturbance would be a really important explanatory variable for these differences. And I have not done that, but maybe I should. That's a great idea. So I have been thinking a lot about this idea of the sort of like the survivorship bias and the inadequacies of the field plots. There's been some work looking at rates of disturbance in the Amazon and demonstrating that our tiny networks of field plots in old growth forests in the Amazon aren't big enough to capture the sort of larger infrequent disturbances, and what that means for our estimates of the Amazon as a carbon source or carbon sink. But I don't know that that's been sort of formally done for chronosequence plots, but it's definitely something that I've been thinking about. So if anyone in here wants to collaborate on something like that, I'd love to talk more about it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. See you.
All right, thanks. So I know a couple of people said that they had to leave, but does there anybody have another question they want to pose before we close out the question and the formal question and answer and just transition into a chat? I will keep the recording open if people have a specific question they want to ask pertinent to the seminar. Here comes Leah Staub. Leah, please go ahead.
Hi, Naomi. Great presentation. I learned a lot, but I was just curious if you could clarify the differences between reforestation reversal and clearing, as well as the difference between deforestation reversal and reforestation.
Yeah, great question. So let me just pull up the appropriate slides here. It'll be a lot easier that way. Just a second. So clearing is what underlies and what drives reforestation reversals. So when I say reforestation,
just a second, Naomi, did you mean to take your slides off the screen? Oh, there they are.
Yeah, I just was switching to this one.
Okay.
So, so clearing is one of the, so I guess I would think of clearing as sort of the land use change that happens that leads to a reforestation reversal, although I'd note that a reforestation reversal could also come from possibly from natural disturbance that reduces forest cover. And so the reforestation reversal I really use to refer to this trajectory where forest cover increases for a while and then starts to decline. And then your question about the difference between deforestation reversal and reforestation, this again relates to sort of like where we are in the time series and the dynamics that the snapshot or subset of time encompasses, right? So so deforestation reversal, I use to label these trajectories where during the study period we saw a decline in forest cover and then later an increase. Whereas reforestation is where we saw a steady and sustained increase over the study period. So you could imagine if I did a study that started, can you all see my mouse? I don't know if you can see my mouse, but if I did a study that started in 2007 here and kept going in time, that this grid cell would have been labeled as reforestation. So it really has to do with like just the way that I'm labeling different trajectories and where we are on different pathways during the time period of the study. Does that clarify?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. I thought I was starting to run out of time, so I did breeze through this kind of quickly. So I'm glad to have the chance to clarify.
Okay, does anybody else have a question they want to ask that's specifically pertinent to the seminar?
I have a question, I think that's really just very broad. I think I'm going to talk to you later, but I think, or now, but like, you saw the recent IPCC report just came out and they say, look, we could get 3 petagrams of carbon, which is 10% of our annual global output from reforestation, but it would cost an intermediate to high amount, right? And they just took that from like Griscom and all these previous papers. And I was just like, to what extent is that just magical thinking? And your study literally says, look, we only get a quarter of that. That is magical thinking. And that's not even in there. That's nowhere. Like, how can we just make people realize that, yes, it's intermediate to high cost, but you'll never get to 3. You're not going to get past 0.75. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think developing more techniques for formally accounting for like creating an up, these estimates come from previous papers. So I think developing techniques to formally incorporate disturbance and climate variability and climate change into these predictions, so that there are better papers to draw from in the future is one thing. And then I do think, I mean, at the end, I tried to get at this, but I do think that it's really important that scientists that we keep our eyes on the prize, that we continue to advocate for alternative energy, for transitioning away from fossil fuels, for the things that we know work and that we have the technology for. And not that we abandon restoration and reforestation as a natural climate solution. Like, we need to try everything, right? We need to try everything. The place that it worries me is where people say, oh, but we're planting trees, therefore whatever I did was offset, right? Or that using trees and tree planting and forest restoration and reforestation as a substitute for the other actions that we need. That's where I get worried. So I think, yeah, we still need to try, and but the realism to me is really important for making sure that we stay focused on these other emissions cuts that we know are probably more important and also more doable. So yeah, I don't know. Everyone wants these good news stories too. It's like, oh, everyone loves trees and we love forests and it's great for biodiversity, and people just cling to whatever little bit of good news that we can. And yeah. So anyway.
Thanks. So Dylan now has a question.
Yeah, I really loved the way that your presentation synthesized multiple studies, and I was kind of curious how that came to be. Was that something that you set out to do? You envisioned that you had, kind of this overarching goal that you wanted to get to, and you laid out those steps individually, or was it more something that one study led to another one, which led to another one, or how did that come about?
Yeah, I am not that organized or strategic, so I'm going to go ahead and say I did not necessarily have sort of a plan to do all of these things. A lot of my research has, because I studied disturbance and I do observational studies of disturbance, my research has tended to be very opportunistic. Some of my other dissertation work was focused on understanding wind disturbance, which came about because my chronosequence plots all blew down one year while I was back taking classes. I left the field and went back the next year and they all blew down. So I've been very opportunistic in that sense. And same with the drought in Puerto Rico. We didn't really know that was happening. When I was putting together this talk, I was thinking, oh, if I had only been more strategic, I could have incorporated the plot data in the field and the remote sensing data in a much more systematic way, rather than publishing two separate studies that ended up that are sort of complementary but not so formally integrated. But I would say that with the second part of the talk on the permanence and landscape dynamics, that was a little bit more sequential, where I did that first study in the area around Pucallpa and then was, thought, wow, this is a really stunning result. I really want to see the extent to which this is a pattern that we see across Latin America and the Caribbean, and got in touch with Mitch, who had this data set that was perfect for looking at that. So that was where one sort of led to the other, whereas the drought work was kind of unfolding sort of in parallel and not with so much foresight. So yeah, my advice is be opportunistic about if you're studying disturbance, be ready to sort of react to things that are occurring, because the landscapes we're working in are so dynamic now. So yeah, that's a great question though.
That's an important method for graduate students too, right?
Yeah.
Are there any other questions before we go ahead and turn off the recording, and then we could just go to stop sharing screen and just open up, put the whole group of people on the screen? Any other questions before we do that? Going once, going twice. Okay, thanks very much. We're going to now stop the recording, and then this will be posted later on the website of the Center for Social Science Scholarship. I'm going to stop the recording now, and we will just adjourn to a virtual chat. So thanks very much.
Thank you all. Those were great questions.